Day 755 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 433,000 military personnel losses, which adds another 700 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, so 9 tanks, 9 APVs, and 16 artillery. Although do note, it was comparatively a much larger set of figures yesterday. And then as for the occasional brief summation of territory of control expressed as a percentage, as here we can see that the total of all land captures by Russia, including Crimea and the Donbass from the 2014 battle lines drawn, are sitting on a total of 18.005% of Ukraine. But in more recent times, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian land gains amount to a lesser figure of 10.721%. So perhaps a bit less than we might have all expected. Then we'll head across to the map today into Russia, where there were no oil refineries hit today. But if those recent successful Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries can be sustained at a high tempo, this would inevitably lead to a significant hampering on Russia's war machine and economy. Not to mention pressuring Russia to move air defenses, reduce exports, and cause unfavorable local price swings on fuel. In fact, Ukraine's daring drone incursions this month alone have already affected Russia's oil prowess, eliminating 600,000 barrels of daily refining capacity, which marks a pretty pivotal moment due to these attacks stretching deep into Russian territory, targeting the vital veins of its own oil industry. Plus, JP Morgan Chase also echoed the severity, but rather stating that Russia lost up to 900,000 barrels a day of oil refining. And so far for Russia, we're looking at about a 15% decrease, instant decrease, of total oil refining capacity so far. And speaking of air defenses, Russian air defenses were once again active in multiple regions throughout Russia today, including at Voronezh, Kursk, and the Belgorod oblasts. Which makes for another very interesting point to raise. You see, 12 months ago, the Russian forces possessed approximately 8,000 S-300 air defense missiles, quite a lot from their Soviet stockpile days, really. And although they've been used plenty since on Ukrainian targets to perform ground-to-ground missile salvos, which has led to some atrocious accuracy instances or issues, Russia's military clearly needs to now update their strategy for a more defensive posture with their S-300 missile stocks, due to all of these new longer-range drone incursions happening at present. In other words, they now need these missiles for the drones coming in, and Ukraine is not slowing down on the production of these things. And it's a situation that has perhaps likely forever changed the dynamics of war between these two nations. Then we head to Belgorod on the map, still in Russia, as the anti-Kremlin Russian insurgent forces inside of Russia continue to engage. Take, for instance, in this case, the Russian Volunteer Corps ambushed an Imperial combat vehicle in Kozinka. Then, a couple of days ago, we saw the remains of the Russian Pantsir S-1 anti-aircraft missiles on the streets of Belgorod. Then, more recently, deeper within Belgorod, and well beyond the point of insurgency, a Russian Zytel radio-electronic combat system was destroyed by the Freedom of Russia Legion. And just to note, these Zytel systems are a mobile truck-mounted electronic warfare jamming communication station, although ironically it was probably spotted firstly by a recon drone, targeted for termination, and later destroyed. Therefore, not protecting against the very thing that it was designed to defend against. It was possibly switched off at the time. Not a joke. We've literally seen this with Russia before. Then also, there was a number of blackouts reported in some bordering town locations on the Russian side, but mostly within the Belgorod Oblast. And with events like these, I mean, this could be Ukraine, but it's not. as these insurgent forces have really flipped the script on what's actually happening in this war now. And Russia's response? Well, take for example the regional authorities of Belgorod that announced the evacuation of more than just a few villages that border Ukraine. Therefore, an action which is pretty much directly at odds with their earlier statement stating that the incursions were under control, resolved with an end put to them. But even then, these evacuations were done with a bit of a different context here. So, for example, imagine you need to evacuate your own city because your own army shells your own people with their artillery. Because, giving a realistic assessment of the situation, understanding that Russia was never going to turn on a dime and completely change its military doctrine of shelling, and more shelling, especially when they find themselves right in the middle of a conflict. Then to add even further context to this situation, evacuees took to social media to complain that their local Belgorod authorities have pretty much forgotten about the people right after they ordered the evacuation, saying that almost no accommodations have been made, there's no support for them on a whole variety of metrics. So just getting them out of there to get some Russian army units in and simply lay waste to the place. And even Putin responded to these incursion events with the power of words, stating that these Russian traitors need to be identified by name so that they can be punished with no statute of limitations. But somehow I don't think a response like that is going to get these Russian volunteer forces shaking in their boots or send them packing. Then headed across to the Ukrainian map today into the Donbass, as while Russia is losing land in their own territory, they continue to double down on the Avdiivka axis and have nearly or somewhat near to taking control of the rest of the Orlivka and Berdichi villages. So I'll zoom in right there for those ones. And with using a measurement ruler, give or take approximately, you're looking at 650 odd meters left in the grey zone to the physically constrained edges of the areas. So the momentum slowdown for the Russian forces has been much more than I would have expected here. Then just below there was geolocated footage that confirmed a Russian presence east of Pervomayaska. So we'll zoom in there. So next to the lake or pond. And we're talking about this chunk of change right here. Though this may have previously been considered a grey zone, but this map actually already accepted it as Russian captured for quite some time now. So not an advance per se, but rather a reassessment of the situation. Then somewhere in the east, a British supplied ASRAAM weapon, which is a heat-seeking short-range surface-to-air missile variant of the system, was noted in Ukrainian service taking down a Russian Supercam UAV. Then also in the east, a Russian BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle was destroyed in the Avdiivka area, this one, and clearly behind enemy lines just by the old coke plant. Then, somewhere in the east, and some incredible footage, but allow me to freeze frame this to explain, as Russian personnel were trying to evacuate a previously damaged and captured Swedish-provided variant of the Leopard 2A5s, these MBTs or main battle tanks. But they came under Ukrainian fire and are thus forced to abort their mission. And in chronological order, so here's how it goes. So the first Ukrainian FPV drone comes in close and loops around the Brems, which are Russian armored recovery vehicles. And so the FPV drone rams into the engine location at the back of the first Brem. Simple yet effective, to stop the cargo train, so to speak. But it doesn't end there, as a second FPV comes in to take out the second Brem. Then a third Ukrainian drone makes an entrance, probably to ensure the job is finished, by which time it really does seem to be running low on battery and locked and loaded, and so decides to completely finish off the job. And all the meanwhile, you'll notice each Russian Brem has its own handmade cope cage. Of course, designed to protect against this very threat, supposedly. But with a quadcopter's ability to operate in a truly three-dimensional landscape with a joystick, cope cages don't really help too much there, as you can see. Plus, out of all of this, it should be noted that the Russian Brem armored recovery vehicles are older Soviet platforms designed for older and lighter Russian main battle tanks. So they're useful for hauling up to about 40 or 50 tons, maybe. But the Swedish 2A5 Leopard, give or take 65 tons. So this is very much conceivably why they needed two of the things. See, modern problems require modern solutions. Then moving across to some news for the day. So in a historic move, the EU Council of Foreign Ministers has given the final approval to allocate an additional 5 billion euros for military aid to Ukraine under the European Peace Fund. This crucial decision, announced by the press service of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, comes as a significant boost to Kyiv's defense capabilities amid the ongoing war against Russian aggression. Then in some other news, so Canada commits $40 million and Finland commits $33 million as part of the Czech-led initiative to source and supply 1.5 million artillery shells for Ukraine. Now previously, the Czech Republic sourced 800,000 shells, but then somehow managed to source another 700,000 on top of that from various third-party nations' existing supplies. Also note, reportedly some of these shells are said to be sourced from Russian allies or Russian adjacent allies. So possibly India, with its NATO standard 155mm caliber shells, had a hand to play in these developments. And hey, there's an outside chance that some corrupt Russian general from the Far East may have found his moment to shine and to sell off a stockpile of the 122mm Soviet caliber shells. And that's a bit of a stretch, but the fact remains the Russian military to this day has rampant corruption on pretty much every level that you can think of. Then, in some more news, German aid, as German Defense Minister Pistorius announced the latest military aid package for Ukraine with a 500 million euro amount made up of 180,000 of the 155mm artillery shells, which will be purchased through the Czech-led initiative. Also, 10,000 artillery shells, immediate delivery from German stockpiles, that one is. Plus another 100,000 artillery shells will be contracted. Then also 100 armored vehicles and 100 high versatility logistics vehicles. Then headed across to a quick funny or two to round it all off today, guys. So before the Russian election was finalized and before the votes were counted, so to speak, there were some Russians who voted at the Russian embassy in the Netherlands, and during their comings and goings were offered blinis, which is a traditional thin Russian pancake type deal, but also offered up with full class on a shovel. No doubt a reference to many previous reports from Russian soldiers angry that a shovel was the only weapon that they were equipped with. And as for the Russian voters, not a lot of takers on the pancake front. And on that topic of the 87% vote landslide victory for Senor Putin, Margarita Simonyan, the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, the Russian state news media outlet, said some quite bizarre words, as if she was setting herself up for a joke, when she stated how she wanted to remind everyone that in Russia's modern history, no other leader has received such high numbers on voting election day. Period. Even comparing to Putin, who has already had 4 terms as president. So, is she hinting at the illegitimacy of the elections? I don't think so. Or is the Russian narrative echo chamber of BS so far up its own behind that even the head of Russia Today believes these figures to be real? I guess so. Well, at least I'm still scratching my head at the absurdity of the claims here. So maybe you guys can write below what it is you think is actually happening here. So thanks again for watching, guys. That's it for today. Please continue to like and comment. I do appreciate it all. Thanks for supporting me as well. And I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.